Where's my stream? There it is. Picking up right where we left off. The rational thinking of the Pasu. After such extensive descriptions, we certainly wish to know how the Pasu thinks. Of course, the first and second operations of reason already implying thinking, as does the activity of the cultural structure in the conscious sphere. To avoid confusions, we shall begin by defining the significance of these terms and specifying their range. Thinking is the activity of the psychic structure comprised, according to figure 11b, it appears with figure 11, of the affective 4 rational, 3 and conscious 2 spheres. In this way, it is clear that thinking is an activity that can happen in any of such spheres. In another section, however, it will be demonstrated that thinking obeys an inevitable hierarchic sequence. Temporally, thinking is first located in the structure of the brain. The living brain constructs the cultural structure that, a posteriori, is also animated by thinking. The living cultural structure constructs the conscious sphere and, a posteriori, is also animated by thinking. When we say, for example, thinking, or because of thinking, etc., it is to be supposed that such thinking can occur in any sphere of the psychic structure, and it is to be inquired in the text by the appropriate reference. Always anticipating definitions, which will be duly fundamented later on, let us consider that thought is the moment of thinking. In other words, thought is the momentary act of thinking. In the next section, we will see that such moment presents a double temporality. On the one side, it registers an actual duration in transcendent time, or time of the macrocosm, and on the other, it registers an immanent time proportional to the energetic intensity of the thought. On the other hand, the particular microcosm of the Pasu is the product of a monad and an archetype. That is to say, the monad sustains the particular microcosm that evolves according to the process of a universal archetype or manu. But the monad never descends into matter, but manifests itself in the microcosm as a being of very subtle entity that has by function to assimilate the evolutive grade reached and to maintain it when the organic disintegration called death is produced. This being is the soul of the Pasu. The soul is that which contributes the non-biological genetic inheritance of evolution to the microcosm and is the one who, when disincarnating, maintains what has evolved in that life to apply it in the life of other microcosms, always advancing toward entelechy. It is understood, then, that the soul, by its function of sustaining and impulsing it toward intellectual individuation, must be present at every point of the microcosm. In truth, no function exists in the microcosm that is not ultimately fundamented by the soul, but from the structural point of view, it is good to distinguish between its different faculties. By faculty of the soul, the potency with which it acts in a structure is to be understood. In this sense, the sensitivity and the intelligence are, for example, faculties. Now then, in the Pasu, thinking is the principal faculty of the soul. Or, in other words, thinking is the manifestation of the soul in the psychic structure. But this manifestation has an unmistakable character. It is the only faculty with which the soul directly expresses the unity of the monad. That is why it is said that thinking is the act of a thinking subject. The soul, as a subject that permanently tends to affirm its own individuality, is the unequivocal reflection of the unity of the monad. We said at the beginning that thinking can happen in any sphere of the psychic structure. The concept of a thinking subject will allow us to understand this faculty of the soul with more precision. Above all, one must attend to the following principle. Every subject requires a structure in which to manifest itself. That is to say, the subject cannot exist without a vehicle for its manifestation. What always exists, even after the death of the Pasu, is the transmigrant soul, but not the subject, which is only an aspect of the soul, characteristic of the state of incarnation, an object of the finality of the Pasu. In synthesis, the subject is a function of the structure. In the microcosm, to expound our thesis on the original psychic structure of the Pasu and the subsequent enchainment of the spirit, we have distinguished three basic structures: the archetypal memory or brain, the cultural structure, and the conscious sphere. Well, each one of such structures can be animated by the thinking subject, according to the just examined principle. Without forgetting that it is always about the same subject, we will call rational subject or reason to the thinking located in the archetypal memory or brain, cultural subject to the thinking that occurs over the cultural structure, and lastly, conscious subject, or historical, to the thinking proper to the conscious sphere, and that will be the principal theme of study in the next section. The force that moves the subject is the will. Thus, the instinctive will enables reason, or the rational subject, to act. In the archetypal memory, the cultural will The cultural will impulses the cultural subject to animate the cultural structure, and the conscious will makes possible that the conscious subject animates the conscious sphere. In Figure 11b, it can be seen that in the systematic analogical representation of eccentric circles, the enclosure 5 corresponds to the cultural will, which is active in the three spheres, 2, 3, and 4. For causes that will be explained in F of the next section. On the other hand, the enclosure 6 of instinctive will is only formed by the intersection of the spheres 3 and 4, which signifies that reason is volitionally independent of the conscious sphere. 2. It can act, and in fact always acts, instinctively, i.e., automatically. In all that follows from the present section, we will concentrate on the description and functional analysis of the cultural structure, which is why every reference or mention of thinking must be understood as corresponding to the cultural subject, or to the rational subject, or reason, for constituting the constructor of the structure of principles and relationships, as already explained. With this criterion of thought, we will only refer to which produce the instinctive and rational subjects, and we will denominate it rational thought, to differentiate it from irrational thoughts, which will be studied in another section. For the same reason, we will say rational thinking, alluding to that thinking which only apprehends rational thoughts. Naturally, such apprehension is only possible because thinking is a volitive subject. Taking into account all these definitions and clarifications, we can already consider the following property. The rational thought of the Pasu originates in all cases over the cultural structure and, from there, emerges toward the upper strata of the psyche, i.e., toward the consciousness sphere. Such a transit of thought can only be understood in the light of the concepts of potency and time, which will be studied in the following section. Here we shall restrict the explanation to the origin of rational thought, since it is produced on the cultural structure. How is it to be understood, then, that thought is produced over the cultural structure? Answer: literally. That is to say, if we do not forget that the cultural structure is an analogical model, the answer is literal. Thought is produced over the structure, on its principles and relationships, i.e., on the systems. That is why rational thought is systematic. As this answer does not allow us to see much, we will try to understand it through an allegory. Let us suppose that we perform the vivisection of an animal and, by means of a craniotomy, we expose its brain. We attentively observe it and affirm it is a cellular structure and it is alive. But, after a closer inspection, we see that different types of activity exist within said structure: bioelectrical, biochemical, neuronal, hematic, etc. If we want to characterize such a difference of activity, we can take movement as a common parameter and notice that in bioelectrical phenomena, what moves are ions in the biochemical molecules. In the neuronal, the same cell, stimulated by a nerve impulse, connects with another, moves, producing synapses. In the hematic, a protein molecule, etc. In other words, in the broad framework of life, which characterizes said cellular or cerebral structure, we distinguish several different movements that come from distinct areas of functional activity. How have we distinguished these movements? How have they become clear to us? We have distinguished them, in the first place, because we do not consider the brain in its totality, as an organic whole, but we have made an abstraction of certain parts: the cells, arteries, veins, and tissues, etc. And, secondly, they have become clear because we observe the abstracted under different lights and optics. Let us now observe the complex lattice of the cultural structure. When we say that the Pasu thinks, we are in a case analogous to that of the brain lives. We imply the essential activity of the organism. Thinking is the state of essential activity of the cultural structure, analogous to the vitality of the cellular structure of the brain. But in this we were distinguishing certain movements, proper to the organic functions, which became clear by abstracting said functions from the structural totality and separately observing them, i.e., by formally framing the functional area and considering it as a phenomenon in itself. In the same way, a rational thought of the Pasu is a distinct and clear movement that is produced in certain regions of the cultural structure. In other words, thinking is the vitality of the cultural structure, and thought is the experience of a system in such structure. The structure is, then, full of mental activity, ebullient with life, like the brain. The Pasu effectuates a rational operation, and a special motion is produced over a system. It is rational thought. But we now understand why that answer should be interpreted literally. Rational thought is only a localized activity over a system of the cultural structure. However, this over should not give rise to misunderstandings. Though it is not an activity that occurs on the surface of the elements of the system, it is not in this superficial sense that we say over. Thought is something distinct from the system, and that is why it occurs over the system. It can move from one system to another or remain over one of them. And it can do all this because rational thought is the experience of the system or the system experienced as thought, i.e., what is effectively thought during thinking. An analogical way of imagining the event that a rational thought occurs in a cultural structure over a system is to suppose that at that moment the system is illuminated. For example, in a structure like that of Figure 12, the thought of a cubic system would only illuminate the 9 nodes and the 20 bonds of the cube, and no other adjacent node or bond. On the basis of such an assumption, which we will see is not entirely without real foundation, we will analogically speak of this or that system being illuminated by a thought. We were wondering at the beginning how a rational thought of the Pasu would be, and now we know that it is produced as part of the activity of thinking, in which the vitality of the cultural structure consists over a system, and that this system is illuminated when it occurs. Now, these thoughts are not spontaneously produced in the cultural structure, but are caused by either of the first two subjects, either by the instinctive subject, i.e., by the two operations of reason, or by the cultural subject, which only exists naturally a posteriori to the cultural structure. Up to now, we consider reason as a structurer of schemata, but it is easy to see that the sensorial sphere is not always affected by new entities, or that reason can effectuate mental operations not related to external entities. However primitive the Pasu is, it can always effectuate intuitive abstractions about entities, i.e., it can differentiate them, extract them from among the remaining entities, and it can also decide about them. In these cases, although the cultural structure is in the process of formation and an independent cultural subject does not yet exist, the operations of reason act as an instinctive subject and are capable of producing thoughts in the cultural structure. The process is as follows. The second operation of reason establishes references between archetypes of the archetypal memory, or, what is the same, certain bioelectrical paths are generated by synapses in the neurophysiological lattice of the brain. Rational thought is produced because, simultaneously with such cerebral activity, a system of the cultural structure is illuminated, i.e., cultural thinking perceives the experience of a system. The question is, by virtue of what process is the neural pathway transferred to the cultural structure as a system? Answer: a bi-univocal correspondence functions between the archetypal memory or brain structure and the cultural structure. We must clarify that the term bi-univocal is used here in the restricted sense of two-way correspondence of the structures, and in no way implies a mathematical homeomorphism, but analogical. It is then only a didactic concept used for convenience, as the whole structural model is also without prejudice that such a model may or may not describe the truth of the real facts. We will only be able to assure that, in the bi-univocal correspondence between a bioelectrical configuration produced in the brain by the instinctive subject and the cultural structure, an equivalent schema that preserves just its topological invariance, i.e., its essential qualities, is transferred to the latter. By saying that between both structures exists a bi-univocal correspondence, we are affirming the possibility that the transference is produced in both senses, i.e., that the activity of reason produces thoughts in the cultural structure, and that certain thoughts of a cultural structure generated in it by the cultural subject cause activity in the archetypal memory. However, as we have already made clear, there can only be a transfer in the latter sense, a posteriori to the cultural structure, i.e., when a cultural subject actually exists in the Pasu. In summary, in two bi-univocally corresponding structures like those that we have described, there is functional solidarity and, as a consequence, simultaneity of processes. That is to say, activity in one structure implies simultaneous activity in the other. A movement of reason causes a simultaneous movement in the cultural structure. For example, the illumination of a system, but a possible movement in the cultural structure, for example, the illumination of a system, simultaneously causes the activity of the rational function. We are thus before a vicious circle in which it does not seem easy to decide, given a simultaneous movement in both structures, which is cause and which is effect. But the solution has already been advanced. In the Pasu, thought is usually produced by the activity of the rational subject. In commentary B of this section we asked, what is the force that moves the Pasu's reason? And the answer was, the instinctive will. This will be then the force that puts into movement the simultaneous activity of the cultural and cerebral structures. But in the section, psychic structure of the animal man or Pasu, the instinctive will was defined as adjusted to multiple patterns of conduct that were causing that the behavior was almost mechanical. The conclusion that one must draw from all this is the following. The Pasu possesses the possibility of developing a psychic subject that generates its own thoughts and causes the activity of reason. While that evolution is realized, as long as a subject independent of reason is not available, the instinctive will determines the function of reason according to the form of the patterns of conduct. Naturally, such patterns are formidable specializations of animal instinct elaborated over millions of years of evolution of the Manu archetype. As we will see later on, it was only when the Hyperborean spirit was enchained to the Pasu that the sphere of consciousness and the conscious subject were developed in these hybrids, the Viryas. The microcosm thus tended toward ontic autonomy in equal measure as the psychic structure, controlled by the conscious subject, tending toward self-consciousness or individuality. Since we are here studying the rational thought of the Pasu, we must for the moment forget the Virya and admit that the activity of the cultural structure is usually determined by the instinctive subject when the cultural subject does not operate. In such conditions it occurs that, because of an operation of reason, which acts motivated, for example, by a food pattern, the illumination of a system is produced in the cultural structure. This is a rational thought, the experience of the schema of an entity. It will depend on the profundity of the thought that part or all of the semic elements that compose the system, the content of which is the schema of the entity, are experienced. But let us not forget that we analogically define rational thought as a formal abstraction of the structure, as an experience that is localized on a system and, from there, emerges toward more elevated regions of the psychic structure. We will see what it depends on for it to occur, but let us anticipate that such an emergence of thought is experienced as if it were a phenomenon independent of the cultural structure, as if it spontaneously arose in the higher stratums of the psyche. Apologize for any extra noise you hear. F. Demiurgic signification and design. Let us consider the cultural structure and define the concept of continuity in it. In a structure, continuity is a topological property, i.e. qualitative, which intuitively can be defined as the possibility of starting from any node and arriving at any other by just moving along the bonds. That is to say, continuity requires that no interruptions are produced during the moment. This is in terms of a simple structure, similar to the model in Figure 12. The cultural structure requires a more rigorous definition. Let us suppose that, after applying the systematic reduction to all the systems of the structure, we unite each principle with its opposite by means of a dialectical relationship. We will thus have a set of systems similar to that of Figure 13. In that case, there is a continuity if all the systems of the set are connected to each other by at least one relationship each. It should be noted that this continuous set of interconnected systems between each other possesses all the characteristics of a structure. The continuity thus defined is a topological property, a pure quality of the structure. But the cultural structure is an organism vitalized by mental activity. No parts or separate qualities exist for it, but rather experiences of systems, thoughts over the structure. It is worth asking, then, how is the continuity of the cultural structure experienced? The question about the experience of a quality can be analogically understood. Let us suppose that someone establishes that our skeleton is continuous in the topological structural sense pointed out before, and asks us how we experience such a quality. Naturally, the answer can only come from a self-examination, given that we cannot feel the skeleton. We can at least effectuate a palpitation. With the hands of our body, this can be an answer. The continuity of the skeleton is, for me, the hardness that the flesh acquires when pressed by the fingers of the hand throughout most of the whole body. Said hardness is continuous because I can go from any point of hardness to any other just by moving my fingers on the body and without ceasing to perceive at any moment the interior hardness. But what does this tell us? that the quality is experienced as an attribute of something else. Continuity is transformed into continuous hardness. In other words, hardness, which is also a quality, i.e., an adjective, has been substantivized, reified, its continuity to be then predicated with the adjective continuous. The hardness, thing, is continuous. It thus turns out that the experience of the quality consists in its substantivization. The answer is the following. In the cultural structure of the Pasu, the structural continuity is experienced as a continuous signification. Here's a concept of capital importance. Signification is a continuum. But justly, because of its importance, it is necessary to clarify this concept. First of all, one must distinguish between signification and significance. Both terms are in relation as the general to the particular, within the same kind, for example, as structure to system, or thinking to thought. Signification is the experiencing of a quality of the structure as such, which can only be obtained if one experiences a total thinking, not focused on any thought or an intuition of such thinking. But the signification is continuous, i.e., it is something substantive, which subsists as a quality of the whole structure. On the other hand, significance is the moment of signification, that which is signified when thought illuminates a system. Once the distinction is made between signification and significance, one must consider that the unity of rational thinking is given by continuous signification. Then, the significance of a rational thought is an inseparable part of the signification of thinking to which it is united at that moment. In the next section, we will approach the study of continuous signification under the temporal aspect. In the meantime, it is useful to get used to the idea that signification is a mental horizon on which significances can stand out as reliefs. Subnote 5. Relief, a protuberance, the differences of elevation on a surface. When thinking, in which the vitality of the cultural structure consists, lacks thought, then the horizon of signification remains at a constant level. Suddenly a thought illuminates a system. On the horizon of signification, at that moment, the relief of the signified stands out. Significance is thus not mere content, but the foundation of rational thought, the subsistent base on which all content rests. We were saying that rational thought is the experience of a system. Now we know that significance is the foundation of thought because it is the experience of continuous signification in the system. But the significance, as a relief of the horizon of signification, has to manifest degrees of importance, the greater or lesser significance of a rational thought. Well, the degrees of significance depend on the profundity of the thought. Let us clarify this concept. Contrary to a merely superficial movement, rational thought, when it occurs over a system, can consist of a part or the totality of its semic elements. The capacity of a thought to include, in its experience, part or the totality of the symbols of a system, i.e., to perceive an appearance or the essence of the schema of an entity, is called profundity. The more profound a rational thought is, the more semic elements of the schema it possesses, the greater its truth is. The degrees of significance depend on the profundity of the thought, i.e., on how much the system has been experienced in semic terms. For example, the degrees of significance depend on how experienced the dimensions of the relationship are in rational thought, extension, comprehension, and potency. But the relationship is a complex symbol that expresses the schema of the entity, the interpretation of the design effectuated by the second operation of reason. Thus we arrive at the two extremes of rational knowledge of the external entity, design and significance. In effect, the essence of the external entity, the being for man, is the demiurgic design that is made evident by rational discovery and constitutes the original extreme of the act of knowing. At the other extreme, in the thought of the entity, the significance is a degree of knowledge determined about the truth of the entity. And between both extremes, of course, it is possible to point out several processes proper to the mode of rational knowing, already studied before: external entity, sensorial sphere; first operation of reason, design; second operation, schema or relationship, significance of the thought of the entity. We said that thought is the act of thinking located over a system, and we add that significance is the foundation of thought, the level of reference on which are seated those semic contents of the schema that have been able to be experienced. But a system is comprised of principles and relationships, and the type of idea in which the thought consists will depend on which of these symbols are signified. If the significance refers to a principle, then the thought will consist of an idea without an image. If the significance comes from a relationship, the thought has the possibility of containing an idea with an image, but it will depend on the active potency of the relationship, as will be explained in the next section. What's up, buddy? See you there. Okay, I'll check that out. I'm not familiar with StreamYard. But I'll check it out. By the way, I read 1996. It's good. It's good. I might talk about it later. G. Demiurgic word and design. Significance and design are the extremes of the process of discovering the entity, but is the finality of the Pasu fulfilled with it? Certainly not, since such finality depends that the significance returns to the entity and points out a meaning in the latter. In this article, said necessity will be evidenced in a general way. The guidelines that determine the problem will also be established. That is to say, if the Pasu is an evolutive being, at what moment of its development should we start to make the descriptions that undoubtedly show its finality of being a giver of meaning, a producer of culture? The mental terminus of the design, of the discovery of the entity, is, then, the significance. But the finality of the Pasu is not only to discover the entities, but to place meaning in the entities, so that from the bosom of the entities emerges the reason of the world. This reason is what justifies the work of the demiurge and the object of his pleasure. It is the good toward which the finality of the Pasu must aim, the goal of its destiny. That is why it is not enough that the design be revealed to the reason of the Pasu and be internally known. It is necessary, fundamentally necessary, that the discovery be exteriorized, that the schema of the entity crosses the sensorial sphere in an inverse sense and bursts outside. This inverse transit and the way in which the significance returns to the entity puts, in first place, the problem of language, the solution of which will be the object of the next article. But now, as an example, let us suppose that significance is expressed by means of the world, the name that the Pasu reassigns to external entities. The bursting outside of the name impulses the entity to gravitate around man with its own meaning, transforming itself from a natural entity into a cultural object. In other words, the field, the sphere of gravitation, of the entities of reason is a specifically human ambit called culture. By entity of reason, of course, we understand those entities, the design of which is structured as a relationship in the cultural structure, i.e. as a schema or noumenon. One must distinguish here between the particular act of discovering the design of the entity and the collective act of expressing a corresponding concept in the termini of a language. The discovery is the particular act proper to the psychic structure of the Pasu. The naming of the entity, giving it meaning by means of an external sign, morpheme, ideogram, symbol, etc., is a collective act, the form of which in general is that of a cultural fact. It is evident, as a bidder of meaning, the Pasu must externally express that design that it has been able to internally discover, but such expression would be without meaning if it were individually emitted, if it was not produced in a socio-cultural framework that would ensure its perpetuation. Hence the principal objective of the Pasu society is to sustain the meaning of entities, i.e. to produce culture. Culture, understood as a social fact, depends on collective communication for its production and development, on the exercise of languages, the signs of which are significant for everyone. Languages, as will be seen, come from the cultural structure, and this is produced throughout life by the archetypal memory and reason, i.e. by the brain. That is why it should be noted that mutual understanding between members of the same cultural community does not depend so much on the convection of significant signs of a language as on the biological fact that all brains are structurally similar. In other words, it is the hereditary archetypal memory, similar in all members of a species, which makes it possible to create analogous psychic cultural structures that derive in languages of common concepts. Now, in all that follows, it is important not to forget that we are studying the Pasu in the evolutive state that it was in when the enchainment of the Hyperborean spirits took place. At that moment, after a long history that here we omit for the sake of brevity, it had been transformed into a univocal cultural subject. Unequivocal cultural subject. However, as we have already previously explained, it had been taken such a... However, as we have already previously explained, it had taken such a long time to arrive at such a state that the development of the plan would sooner or later have to be cancelled, i.e., its future as a species could only be extinction. From it, as will be seen, the treason of the Siddhas saved it. In any case, the Pasu was possessing, at the time, the two basic elements of every producer of culture: highly developed gregarious instinct and collective communication by means of a language. It is clear that said communication was phonetic and so primitive that the language was comprising of very few words, i.e., phonemes with root signification. The exercise of a language, no matter how primitive it may be, implies the fact of its learning. And to learn means to take something given. In the case of the language of the Pasu, what the latter takes when learning are the words, i.e. the phonetic expression of the design of the entities, the meaning of which is common to the members of the tribal society. We must well understand the fact of phonetic expression, a signer of meaning, before continuing the study of the cultural structure. First and foremost, it is necessary to repeat that entities are designated by the demiurge since the beginning of their existence, and that such a design constitutes the beginning of their existence, and that such a design constitutes the essence discovered by the rational function, the being for man. Therefore, the words of the Pasu language were not created to designate entities, but come from the interpretation that the rational function effectuated to the a priori designs. This means that the words come from the cultural structure, or concretely, from the bonds or relationships, i.e. from the structured archetypal interpretation of the design of the entities. A word that names an entity has to reflect a relationship of the cultural structure, a complex symbol, and has to express a significance. That significance, intelligible to all the possessors of the language, is the meaning of the entity, which will allow its external structuring as a cultural object. Whoever inferred that the finality of the Pasu is fulfilled by the expression of the signified word would be mistaken. The truth is that the word only expresses the significance of the entity in a language. Culture also consists in multiplying the common or collective languages, expanding the scope of the signification of the entities, and with it intensifying the meaning of the world, affirming its reason for being. This will be better understood after studying the next article, in which the questions, what is a language, and what is the structural origin of the different languages, are given as an answer. Patrick. Okay. Hangouts. Okay. Oh, no worries, buddy. No worries. I'm here. Whenever. Whenever you're ready. How long have I been streaming? What time is it? Okay. Oh my. Okay. H. The rational languages of the Pasu. In Commentary F, we have mentioned 4 facts that are of particular interest to us here. The first is that the finality of the Pasu demands that the meaning of the entity, i.e. the fundament of the idea of the entity, be expressed outside. The second is that such expression constitutes a collective or cultural fact. The third is that, by being a collective fact, the expression of the meaning must be manifested in the terms of a language. The fourth is that culture, i.e. the collective activity of particular subjects, makes possible that, for the expression of the meanings, multiple languages exist. In order to go deeper into these 4 facts, it is convenient to put them in the form of a question. First, how is the meaning of the entity expressed outside? Second, what is a cultural fact? Third, what is a rational language? And fourth, what is the structural origin of the multiple languages? However, for reasons of explanatory methodology, it will be necessary to respond following an inverse order. In this article, we will give an answer to the last 2 questions, and in the next, to the remaining ones. 1. What is a rational language? To answer this question, we need to stipulate the concept of structural mode, and we will intuitively acquire it, observing the structure represented in Figure 12. It is evident that a cubic lattice has been denominated to said structure because its nodes and bonds determine the shape of a cube. But what is perhaps not so evident is that such a property is a particular case of the following general law of structures. Every structure determines a form, from where every form determined by a structure is a function of the structural modality. The general law will become evident if we admit that in any structure, whatever its frame, a determinate formal profile is always configured. But the fact of the shape is established, we see that it depends on the way the bonds are arranged. They can be joined with the nodes to form a cube, an octahedron, or any other polyhedron. In summary, the shape depends on the way in which the bonds are structured. In structural morphology, the concept of homology is also used, which serves to refer to formally similar structures. But we will say that those substructures constructed on the base of the same structural mode have homologous form. That is to say, in a structure, we can point out by inspection and abstraction, for example, two cubes without common bonds. Such cubes are, according to our previous definitions, two substructures. We then say the forms are homologous. The substructures, which determine said forms, possess the same modality. The formal homology between the substructures depends, then, on the modality with which those are constructed. What does the structural mode consist of? Answer: an ultimate formal pattern exists, which cannot be decomposed through reduction. The modality of a structure is the way such an irreducible pattern is reproduced in the architecture of the system. Of course, when we say substructure, we can also say system, and refer to the way how said system is structured, speaking of the shape of the system. Let us apply these concepts to the cultural structure. It has been seen that every substructure, according to its mode, determines a shape. If the considered substructure is a relationship, its shape is the schema of the entity in which it consists. In this sense, the mode is a sort of fourth dimension of the relationship, together with extension, comprehension, and potency. A formal dimension. But because the concept of mode far surpasses the limits of the relationship, since its extension reaches the whole structure, it is convenient to consider it as a dimension of the systems. What is, then, a language? Let us recall the operation that we define as function between relationships and principles, and that which denominate reduction. It allows us to simplify systems in such a way that a complex system can be reduced to a set of simple systems, and any simple system is feasible to be synthesized as Figure 13 shows, i.e., as a relationship between opposite principles. Having this operation of reduction in view, we can begin by emphasizing that, before all else, language is the inverse operation of structural reduction. But reduction is an internal operation of systems. Is language perhaps a systematic operation? In effect, in the most general way, it can be affirmed that all language is the possibility that reason has to construct a system. We will try to clarify the meaning of this affirmation. Let us specify, first of all, how the word construct is to be understood. Construct. And to do so, let us begin by highlighting the most obvious. The act of constructing supposes a fundamental material that is arranged in accordance with a determinate order during construction. For example, a house is constructed with bricks, a machine with parts, a geometric figure with points, lines, and planes, a structure with nodes and bonds. In the structural sense, construct means to connect nodes with bonds according to a formal mode, i.e., to an order of construction. For example, in the structure of Figure 12, the modality is cubic because the formal pattern that is reproduced throughout the lattice is the cube. It is clear, then, that in a structure, the bricks, the pieces of construction, are the nodes and the bonds, and that the formal mode is the order with which such bricks fit into the building. We have just affirmed that all language is the possibility of constructing a system. With what is a language system constructed? With what is a language system constructed? Answer: the fundamental element of all language is the simple system, whose analogical schema we saw in Figure 13. It is evident that if a language, which is a system, is constructed with simple systems, it can only be a complex system. We can then complete our previous definition and say, all language is the rational possibility of constructing a complex system. Now, this clarification tells us nothing about the way in which said possibility becomes effective, i.e., about the modality of a system. But such an omission is justified because the definition of language as rational possibility prevents pointing out a priori the formal mode with which all possible languages have to be constructed. At most, we can effectuate a formal study of some existent languages and qualify their modality, i.e., the way the internal structures of the complex system in which they consist are constructed. In existent languages, their formal mode, i.e., the way the complex system grows, is denominated logical modality, or simply internal logic of the system. Of course, the question of language is not satisfied by explaining how a complex system is constructed. It is also necessary to know what determinations the fact of language introduces into thought. In effect, we have seen that rational thought is the experience of a simple system, but if said system forms part of a language, what is the determination that the latter imposes on it? Answer: language determines the meaningful context of thought. To understand this, let us remember that we imagine the significance of a thought as a relief on the continuous horizon of signification. Let us suppose now that such a relief is analogous to a mountain peak elevated over a determinate geography. Toward the north, for example, other mountains stand out, a valley toward the south, a sea to the east, a plain furrowed by rivers to the west. We can have an intuitive idea about the meaningful context of the significance if we call the mountains, valleys, seas, plains, rivers, etc., which surround it, and give it geographical meaning, the geographical context of the mountain peak. A mountain peak cannot exist isolated from a geographical context, like a significance does not signify anything outside the meaningful context of a language. Evidence that the meaningful context is a function of the logical modality of the language should also be intuitive. In the previous example, a distinct geographical modality would make the mountain peak appear surrounded by a different context. The significance of a thought, considered in the meaningful context of a language, is denominated concept. But it must be clear, only within the framework of a language is the significance a concept. Nor should we confuse concept with simple system, because thought and meaning originate in simple systems. As we will shortly see, a system can be part of several languages and, therefore, have several meaningful contexts that modify the form of the concept. Views. I really thought my Free Palestine video would. Do you find that suspicious? That it's not? 2. What is the structural origin of the multiple languages? At the beginning of the article, together with the question of language, we proposed the question of the structural origin of the different languages. To now find the answer, we must consider the construction elements of a language, i.e., the simple systems that we show in Figure 13. A language is constructed with one or more of these systems, which are structured in order of a particular logical modality. Let us remember what these systems consist in. Principles and relationships. The principles are permanent psychic representations of innate archetypes. The relationships are schemata of entities, and both members, principles and relationships, are semic terms. The former, simple symbols, the latter, complex symbols. Thought is the experience of principles and relationships constituted in a system, and their content is erected upon significance as ideas without an image or ideas that may have an image. We said when studying reduction that the principles, by being simple symbols, are irreducible. This irreducible character of the principles determines that what is signified in a corresponding thought is self-evident, which cannot be denied. That is why the principles of the cultural structure are known as pure concepts of understanding, categories, mathematical principles, logical principles, etc. By principles, i.e., by simple symbols, the schemata of any entity are formed and constitute relationships. Undoubtedly, a simple system, formed by a principle and a relationship, is determined by the evidence of the principle and relationship. Undoubtedly, a simple system, formed by a principle and a relationship, is determined by the evidence of the principle. Hence, a language or complex system constructed only with certain simple systems as fundamental elements, repeated according to a determinate logical modality, can be completely different from another language elaborated from different systems. Reason is, then, capable of constructing multiple languages. Now, in these systems, which act as fundamental language elements and the evidence of which comes from the internal principle, what class of entity is schematized in the relationship? Answer: an internal entity. The fundamental elements of a language, as systems, are not, then, of the same class as the systems that produce the knowledge of the external entities. It is worth asking, what difference does it make that the element of a language is the schema of an internal entity in relation to the schemata of external entities? Answer: the schema of an internal entity consists in one or more archetypal symbols, without reference to external entities. Let us recall that an archetypal symbol is a symbol that only differs from a principle in potency, a concept that will be defined in the next section. A principle possesses passive potency, an archetypal symbol corresponding to the same archetype as said principle, but substructured in a relationship, possesses active potency. When the schema of a relationship does not correspond to an external entity, it is an internal entity, and, in the case that we are considering, part of a language element or system. Classic examples of existing languages are languages and mathematical structures. Let us consider some fundamental elements of such languages. If an archetypal symbol of a relationship is substantivized or reified, and another symbol is linked to the first as a predication of some quality, the system constitutes an idiomatic sentence. If an archetypal symbol and another symbol are linked in function of the first, the system constitutes an axiom or mathematical equation. It will depend on how many and which sentences or axioms are used to construct the language, and on the modality with which these elements are reproduced, the type of structure that the produced language possesses. On the other hand, given a number of particular axioms, it is possible, for example, to define certain relationships between them, thus determining the modality of the mathematical structure, which can be a group, ring, body, vectorial space, etc. And the same can be exemplified in idiomatic language, by means of certain defined relationships between elementary assertions, different logical modalities in syntactic structures of judgments, propositions, sentences, etc., will be determined. Continuing with these examples, it is easy to comprehend that, starting from idiomatic or mathematical systems, i.e. sentences or axioms, it is possible to develop structures of complex systems, or languages, with two principal characteristics. 1. The systems derived from fundamental elements, their schemata, bear no correspondence with the external entities. 2. Complex systems never stop growing, or in other words, complex systems indefinitely grow from within. In the cultural structure, the region where languages are structured, i.e. their fundamental elements, and those systems constructed with them, is denominated habitual structure. The rest of the cultural structure, formed by systems with schemata of external entities, is called actual structure. It should be noted that, while the actual structure is permanent and a priori to all language, the habitual structure is a posteriori to the knowledge of entities and is constituted by virtual systems, necessarily incomplete because the possibility of its construction underlies in the fundamental elements. But if, as we have seen, languages originate in evident systems, exclusively found on pure simples, in what way can the truth of an external entity be comprehended by the terms of a language? Answer: by the application of the translative faculty of rational thinking, of which measure is intelligence. Let us consider the following definition. Intelligence is the capacity that rational thinking possesses to semiotically translate the schema of an entity into the greatest possible number of languages. Such capacity is called translative faculty. This definition is indicating to us that it is necessary to distinguish between schema of the entity and translation of the schema into a determinate language. But the schema is the truth of the entity in the cultural structure, the rational interpretation of the essence or design, and such truth has been structured a priori to every language. If it can be translated into a multiplicity of languages, it signifies that each one will only contain one part of the truth of the entity, one aspect or appearance. That is to say, every definition or quiddity of an entity in any language describes only a part of the truth of the entity. It is an incomplete symbol. However, we still do not know how intelligence translates the schema to the terms of the linguistic system. We will give the answer then, just as we are accustomed to do. We will intuitively explain it by means of structural analogies. When the rational thinking of the Pasu procures to apprehend the thought of a system, the truth of an entity, in terms of a language, its translative faculty enables it to see or notice the system in the meaningful context of said language. Then the truth of the entity is translated as intelligible concept or linguistic meaning. What the translative faculty does is facilitate the vision of the schema from a determinate perspective, in such a way that the meaningful context of thought conditions the meaning as a concept of the schema. It codifies or annotates it in terms of the contextual language. Strictly speaking, the translative faculty consists in applying the habitual structure over the real structure to establish semiotic correspondences. The virtual complex system of language is expanded over the real system of the entity, situating the schema into its meaningful context. Those symbols of the schema that correspond with symbols of language are actualized in the concept that, naturally, can only contain one aspect of the truth, some equivalent symbols or notes of the schema. One can acquire an intuitive idea of all of this attentively observing the lattice in Figure 14. In space geometry, it is demonstrated that infinite planes pass through a straight line. In four of these infinite planes that pass through the XX system we have structured, with nodes and bonds, the meshes ABCD, EFGH, IJKL, MNOP. Let us suppose that each one of these meshes forms part of the virtual structure of four different languages and that XX system represents the schema of an external entity. In that case, we can affirm that each mesh on its plane is analogous to the meaningful context of a language and that the aspect of the XX system, noted from the perspective of the plane that contains it, is the concept of the schema, i.e., the significance as opposed to the meaningful context. The planes of each meaningful context are denominated planes of signification. It is evident that in the XX system of Figure 14, the truth of the entity can be seen or noted under four different concepts, even if one could see into many more by only adding language meshes on the other planes of signification. If such a lattice belonged to the cultural structure, intelligence would consist in the capacity to notice the XX system in the greatest quantity of meaningful contexts, for example in ABXCDX, EFXGHX, IJXKLX, etc. Accompanying Figure 14 with the side view of the lattice, represented in Figure 15, we will be able to analogically advance the idea of concept. The problem is the following. If each one of the four languages of Figure 14 determines a concept of the XX system, which analogical part of the XX system, which portion of the cylindrical bond corresponds to each one of the four concepts? Answer. Each concept is equivalent to a longitudinal slice of the XX system cut on the plane of signification of the languages. In Figure 15 can be seen, in dotted lines, the profile of the four slices, or concepts, of the XX system, determined by the languages ABCD, EFGH, IJKL, and MNOP. Now, the principles, as we know, are irreducible, so the slice of the concept can only be cut from the cylindrical bond or relationship. In Figure 16, we have represented one of these slices of the bond that analogically corresponds to the concept. A slice of the cylindrical bond is to be determined by its spatial dimensions, length and volume. Analogously, concept is determined by the dimensions of the relationship, extension and comprehension. Let us remember that the relationship is the semic schema of the entity. The extension denotes the class of all the simple symbols that are substructured in the schema. The comprehension is the measure of the truth of the entity. It indicates how close the schema is to representing the design, how many properties of the latter correspond to the former. That is why the comprehension is analogous to the volume of the bond, i.e., to the complexion of the substructure itself. Those two dimensions determine the concept, and we will now see how. First, let us observe that if the concept is a longitudinal proportion of the relationship, then the extension of a concept is equal to the extension of the relationship that it signifies. In consequence, every concept has to significantly encompass the class of all symbols that are under the extension of its relationship. Next, let us note that the volume of a slice has to be manifestly smaller than the volume of the cylindrical bond from which it was cut. This means that the comprehension of a concept is always less than the comprehension of its relationship. For the comprehension of the concept to be equal to that of the relationship, the volume of the slice would be equal to that of the cylindrical bond, and it can only happen in the case that the translative faculty situates the relationship in infinite meaningful contexts. But it goes without saying, this possibility marks the maximum theoretical limit of the intelligence of a Pasu. One would have to see how such an intelligent Pasu would manage to exteriorly express those infinite concepts in infinite languages. Of course, this does not imply that one cannot grasp the truth of the entity in its totality. It occurs when the experience of the system is grasped by the thinking as thought of the whole schema. But it is something very different to attempt to express that experience. Then there is no other solution than to enclose the truth in the context of a language and to manifest its concept. The extension of a relationship is a quantitative dimension. It determines the quantity of semic elements that integrate the schema. On the contrary, comprehension is a qualitative dimension, since it determines the degree of truth of the schema according to the qualities that correspond to the design. Of such qualities, the concept can only take some notes, since its comprehension is always minor. And that slice of truth, that aspect of the schema that has been noted in the meaningful context of a language, is what the Pasu expresses and divulges in the socio-cultural world, what acquires fame and becomes news. In summary, the concept is determined also by two dimensions, extension and comprehension. The extension of a concept is equal to the extension of a relationship and refers to the quantity of semic elements of the schema. The comprehension of a concept indicates which notes of its content correspond to semic qualities or dispositions of the schema, how close the latter is to coinciding with the truth of the entity. We have seen that a relationship, such as that of the XX system in Figure 14, can be seen or noted in various meaningful contexts or languages. The resulting concepts are analogous to the slice in Figure 16. Let us now observe Figure 15, to where, with dotted lines, the outlines of the four slices or concepts are highlighted, each one of which is on its plane of signification. It is evident that each plane intersects the others in a common straight line, XX, which serves as the axial axis of the cylindrical bond. But said planes correspond to each of the meaningful contexts of different languages. Then, what certainly intersects at the core of the system are the languages themselves, as can be seen in Figure 14. Precisely, it is the different obliquity of the languages that makes possible the existence of multiple concepts on the same truth. Such an intersection of languages produces, in the four concept slices, a common region around the XX axial axis, as shown in Figure 16. This region, which is called the concept's connotative nucleus, or simply connotation, is a dimension proper to concepts, which we will now explain. Each concept includes all the notes about the truth of the entity noted in the meaningful context of its language, but the fact that all concepts of the same truth overlap in a common region implies the community of some class of notes. In other terms, the concepts of the same truth participate in certain common notes. But where is the region of common notes? As one can see in Figure 16, in the depth of the concept, i.e., in the center of the comprehension. It is because of this condition that, when profoundly thinking the concept of a truth, it usually causes the perception of second meanings, i.e., the connotation of other concepts about the same truth. What occurs is that the profundity of thought leads to the connotative nucleus, to the axial axis of the relationship, i.e., to the axis where the languages intersect, and that is why it is possible, from there, to glimpse other contexts of signification, to note other connotative concepts. From there, the rational access to a more complete comprehension of the truth of an entity consists in deepening the concept until reaching the connotative nucleus, then procuring that the translative faculty exercises the intellectual intuition of the connoted concept. The possibility of reaching the connotative nucleus that underlies every concept can also have another important utility. By perceiving the connotative concept, it is possible to advance on the meaningful context of its language and reach the habitual structure or virtual origin of such a language. In this way, one manages to systematically reconstruct languages that until then were only virtual, i.e., they were possibilities of the cultural structure. It is somewhat obvious, but it should be noted here, that the rational mentality is averse to taking oblique paths. It usually keeps one or two horizontal languages without going deeper into the concepts, without paying attention to the connotative nuclei, and, of course, without ever entering into oblique contexts of meaning. Connotation, just as it has been defined here, is a structural dimension of the concept and refers to the participation of various concepts in the common notes of the same truth. However, concepts often also connote, although more weakly, meanings belonging to truths of other entities. It is denominated connotation of contiguous meanings. It occurs because the adjacent relationships of the cultural structure can be on the same plane of signification. Then it results that the connotative nuclei of both concepts are connected by the common language and mutually connote their meanings. It is clear that this is not a true connotation, i.e. the product of the intersection of languages, but a defect of rational thought caused by the variety of the limits of significance, which come to brush against the limits of contiguous significance. When rational thought concentrates on a system, the limits of significance are sharply defined in the meaningful context of the concept, without coming to brush against adjacent concepts situated on the same plane of signification. Then the only possible connotation is that which is produced by the intersection of languages in the connotative nucleus of the concept. Up to here we have answered the last question. It is now convenient, before going to the next article, to review the obtained responses. To the question, what is a language? It has been answered that it is the possibility of constructing a complex system using as fundamental elements simple systems structured according to a particular formal modality. We also learned that the significance of a thought, considered in the meaningful context of a language, is the concept. The following question, what is the structural origin of the multiple languages, allowed us to know that the cultural structure is comprised of habitual structure and real structure. The real structure is exclusively constituted by systems that contain schemata of external entities, i.e., entities of which design has transcended the sensorial sphere, thence the denomination of real. Reality comes from the effective discovery of the design. The habitual structure, on the other hand, consists in the simple systems of multiple languages with which the translative faculty could conceptually interpret the schemata of the real structure. The simple systems of a language are substructures of archetypal symbols, actualized by a certain active potency, and represent internal entities, i.e. principles or structural combinations of principles. Depending on the simple systems that intervene and how the logical modality is related, each virtual language can be expanded over the real structure in any sense and determine the meaningful context of the experienced or thought real system. Then the meaning which fundaments the thought of that system is noted in contrast with the context of language and codified as a concept. But the application to the thought system of multiple meaningful contexts expanded from the habitual structure being possible, it turns out that the meaning of the schema, foundation of the rational thought of it, can be apprehended by thinking under the form of multiple concepts, each of which contains part of the truth of the entity. The concept, as a particular vision of the truth of the entity in the context of a language, is especially determined by the dimensions of the relationship that it signifies, extension and comprehension, to which is added a new dimension proper to the concept called connotation. In synthesis, languages are systems of conceptual significances, but systems that possess a habitual part, i.e., a disposition for systematic expansion over the real structure, which is the cause of conceptual rationalization, and an effectively existent part in continuous growth, formed by the conceptual meanings of those schemata, have been the object of thought. Languages are, thus, capable of conceptually rationalizing any schema of the real structure. The systematic rationalization of the real structure consists not only in conceptually codifying the schemata of external entities, but also in systematically grouping the concepts according to arbitrary cardinal and ordinal determinations. In this way, the group of concepts forms a system and expresses a group meaning, i.e., concepts of concepts are obtained. This is possible because intelligence is the faculty of translating concepts from one language to another, from where one infers that there are languages of which concepts can contain classes of concepts of other languages when being systematically applied over groups of schemata. That is why the capacity of classifying is the principal effect of intelligence and the basis of all rational method. A typical example of systematic classification is the taxological method of science that consists in grouping entities according to their structural homology. For that purpose, taxa such as species, genus, family, order, class, branch, kingdom, etc. are defined. The thought of a system of the truth of an entity, when being conceptually thought in one language, can also be classified in another due to the effect of the translative capacity of intelligence. What relationship exists between this capacity and the finality of the Pasu? This is what will become clear in the following article. I'm going to stop there. Next one will continue with I, finality and suprafinality, language and expression. Thank you for joining me today.